And don't think you're going to have a gun to defend yourself in the absence of police, because Mamdani wants to make sure you don't have a gun either. We need to ban all the guns, he writes. And then there's very contemporaneous socialist policies. Now, grocery stores in New York City are expensive and not that common. And there's a reason for these realities. They're not that common because they often get looted. They get shoplifted to death. So a lot of them flee. And then they create what are called by the progressives, by the socialists, well, there's food deserts. There's no place for people to buy food. Of course not, because your people drove these businesses out of the community. What businesses are left that are willing to endure this looting, this rampant shoplifting, this uncontrolled crime, where these people, even if caught, are not held accountable by the criminal justice system in any meaningful way. In many of these jurisdictions, they literally decriminalize property theft below $1,000. And they know this. So the people repeatedly steal quantities of goods that are less than $1,000 and are subject to no meaningful penalty. So the stores that are willing to remain, guess what? They have to endure. They have to endure these realities, the theft, the violence. They also have to pay their people a lot of money because all these urban centers raise the minimum wage to $20. Mamdani is demanding $30 an hour for these people. Where do you think that expense goes? It gets tacked on to the cost of the goods in the stores. So because of the crime, the violence, the looting, the shoplifting, the higher cost, the unbelievable property and regulatory taxes in New York, items in New York grocery stores are expensive. All these costs add up. They all have to be recovered by the store. By the way, these stores typically have a profit margin well under 2%. 1.6% is a pretty typical profit margin for a supermarket. So they don't have to take many hits before that 1.6% profit margin is obliterated. And then what do? They continue operating at a loss forever to provide free food to shoplifters and to pay government hacks through their property taxes and regulatory fees and be subject to violence by the members of the community? Of course not. They leave. But if they stay, what they're selling is expensive because of all these externalized costs that need to be recovered by the business. Well, Mamdani doesn't like this. He doesn't like that things are expensive. But when it comes to things like high rates of crime in certain American demographics, the progressives love to say, well, you can't just look at what's directly happening. You can't look at the fact that there's one fraction of a demographic in America that's 5% of the population that commits more than 50% of the violent crime. You can't look at that. You have to look at the root causes. The root causes. That's what's responsible for these murders, for all this violent crime. Can't just put the individuals committing the crimes into prison. That wouldn't solve the underlying problem. You have to look at the root causes. But when it comes to high prices in New York City grocery stores, definitely don't look at the root causes. Don't look at what's contributing to those high prices. Just look at the direct consequence. Look at those greedy supermarkets with their 1.6% profit margins. You know what we need to do? Mamdani says, we need to obliterate them. We need to obliterate them by putting in place government competition. Government competition will provide food at a lower price in the grocery stores. You know why? Because we're not going to ask them to pay things like property taxes and regulatory fees. So therefore, they'll be able to operate at a lower cost. And you'll all save money. Free savings for everyone in New York. What do you think is going to happen to the capitalist supermarkets when they have to compete against government supermarkets that are operating at a much lower cost structure because the taxpayers are subsidizing all of this? Obviously, the private supermarket has to pay property taxes and regulatory fees. They're just leaving, folks. They will just leave. They're not going to stay and operate at a loss. They're not going to compete against government-run supermarkets that can cover their costs through the taxpayer. And then we'll have government supermarkets. Don't take my word for it. Listen to this guy himself.
Grocery prices are out of control. The cost of eggs and milk has skyrocketed. Some stores are even using dynamic pricing, jacking up the cost over the course of a day depending on what they can get away with. It doesn't need to be this way. I'm Zohran Mamdani, and as mayor, I will create a network of city-owned grocery stores. It's like a public option for produce. We will redirect city funds from corporate supermarkets to city-owned grocery stores.
So he's literally going to raid funds from corporate, privately owned grocery stores to the government stores. What do you think the consequence? What do you think those private grocery stores are going to do in response? Just allow themselves to be raided and their money sent to their government competitors and just sit there and eat the loss?
Whose mission is lower prices, not price gouging. These stores will operate without a profit motive or having to pay property taxes or rent.
They won't have to pay. The government stores won't have to pay property taxes or rent. What do you think happens to all the private sector competition to these government stores that don't have to pay property taxes or rent? You think the private grocery stores can stay competitive? Are they just going to stay there and lose millions of dollars every year? Or you think they're going to say, screw it, use your government supermarkets, we're out?
Pass on those savings to you. Grocery prices.
What else does he want to do, this guy? Wall Street Apes, a good follow on X, says, Zohran Mamdani plans on making new laws saying it doesn't matter where companies are headquartered. If you do business in New York, you have to pay his increased corporate tax rate. So he's planning to raise billions, tens of billions of dollars by taxing corporations in New York. What do you think those corporations are going to do? Do you think they're just going to sit there and get gouged by this Muslim socialist? Or you think these multi-billion-dollar corporations in New York can figure out other places to work? How many of them have already moved from Manhattan into New Jersey? And if you tell them that even if you do a scintilla of your work in New York, we're going to tax you as if you were still headquartered here, which is what Mamdani is advocating here, you know what those corporations will do? They won't do a scintilla of work in New York City. You're only driving them completely out of the city when before they were 90% out. Why do you think Trump no longer lives in New York? Why do you think Rush Limbaugh, who built his radio empire in New York City, ultimately fled New York for Florida? He wouldn't, if you remember from his radio show, Rush would talk about the fact that he wouldn't even fly through New York. Because if he flew through New York to some other destination, the one day he was in the city, the New York City government would find out and they would send him a tax bill for the one day he was physically present in the city. What do you think the unintended consequences, or maybe they're the intended consequences? But it's all free. It's free, cheaper food. It's free money from corporations. Of course, he's also talking about freezing the rent. So landlords in New York will now have their rent frozen, as if New York City doesn't have decades of experience with rent control and how that doesn't work. When you have rent control, who builds new housing units? Nobody, because you can't make your money back because they're going to control your rent. When you're in a rent-controlled apartment, who leaves? Who leaves and moves to another apartment? Now we're at risk of losing their rent control. Nobody. When I lived in New York, there were apartments where they might have been bought in the 20s by someone who's now a deceased grandmother. And then their children took it over. Never changed the lease, just kept paying the rent. And then their children took it over. Never changed the lease, just kept paying the rent in the name of a dead person so they could maintain their rent control. Everybody's familiar with the TV show Friends, right? How do you think those people had that nice apartment? Well, the story in the TV show was that it was actually owned by one of their parents who had it as rent control, and they had just moved in. It completely freezes the housing market. There's no growth, and there's no maintenance because the landlords aren't making enough money for maintenance. But I guess we can always do with the rental market in New York what we've done, what Mamdani wants to do with the grocery market. Why don't we just make it all government housing? Because have any of you ever been in government housing? You know what that looks like? New York's got lots of that too. It doesn't look very nice. Of course, he wants to raise the minimum wage, as they always want to do, from the current $16.50 an hour in New York City to $30 an hour. Now, I can tell you, I know people who live in New York, no one's getting paid $16.50. Everyone's getting paid at least $20 an hour in order to be competitive. Mamdani wants to raise that to 30. Here's Jim Girardi. Again, this, of course, this increased minimum wage cost sounds like free money. It's like a kindergarten teacher view of the world. Oh, Tommy, you brought in candy to the class? I hope you brought enough for everyone. We can't have only you have candy. We have to take your candy and share it among all the children who don't have candy. But what happens when you pay everybody more money, a higher minimum wage? The effect is not to raise the income of those people, because all the people who are higher than them in the economic hierarchy, especially all the labor workers, and there's union workers, and there's plenty of that in New York City, the union workers' pay is tied to the minimum wage. So when you raise the minimum wage, he wants to double it from $16.50 to $30 an hour. That just raises everyone else's compensation too. So now everyone has more money to chase the limited number of apartments, the limited supplies of food. The prices just go up for everybody. And no one has actual increased purchase value, purchase power. It just contributes to higher cost, inflation across the board. Jim Girardi writes, another reason products of all kinds in the city cost more than elsewhere is because labor is more expensive in the city than almost everywhere else. The minimum wage in New York is currently $16.50 per hour, tied for fourth highest minimum wage in the country. Mamdani pledges that if elected, he'll raise the city's minimum wage to $20 per hour and ultimately to $30 per hour in 5 years. This will not make any product any cheaper. Of course not. You just have more dollars chasing the same amount of goods or even fewer goods, because we all know what happens with government supermarkets, right? It's not like it hasn't been tried. These are images from Cuba. Life before the communists took over, life after the communists took over. Even the clerk lost weight. Look at him. Those of you of a certain age who remember the Soviet Union before its collapse, you'll be familiar with pictures like this. We saw them all the time. Hundreds of people in food lines and at counters with shelves that were bare. There's nothing to buy. These people are starving. Here's 1980s USSR. Shows Zohran's plan fully realized. Empty shells. We've all seen pictures of people, exchange students, others, visitors from the Soviet Union who came to America and were walked into a supermarket, an American supermarket, and couldn't believe it was real. Couldn't believe that every shelf was covered with goods. The meat cabinet was full of meats, anything you could want. An entire aisle dedicated to food for pets. They'd never seen anything like it in their lives. Many of them would try to run out of the store because they would presume it was a store that was limited exclusively to high-level government officials, and they would get in trouble for being in there, because that's how it worked in the Soviet Union. Here's a little more into supermarket stuff. This guy, Mamdani, has no idea what he's talking about. The average grocery store in the U.S. has a margin of just 1.6%. It's probably less than that in New York, given their higher underlying costs. They already have the lowest relative prices. You know why? The dreaded profit motive. If stores didn't earn more than they spent, what would be the point of providing a better service than others? What would be the point of operating the business in the first place? At a loss. Stores compete with one another to be more efficient, thereby racing to offer better service and lower prices than their competitors. Competition drives prices down to the equilibrium level where consumers and producers are all happy. Well, I wouldn't say happy. I mean, again, a lot of the costs at the supermarket that consumers are unhappy paying is because the government of New York builds those costs in. Rents, property taxes, regulatory fees, minimum wages. It's always a race to the bottom for the stores. Prices can't go any lower. You have to cover your costs. And it's not the store's fault that they're rising. That's the beauty of the free market. This fantasy world, government-run grocery store will fail spectacularly if it's ever built at all. And of course, it'll have to pay rent. It's simply be coming out of your tax dollars. The underlying land has value, right? Rent value. and through increased deficit spending, pushing these grocery store prices up further. Then I had a response here. Oh no, here we go. Cheap groceries at the new government-owned store translates to the same price as other stores, and your taxes are going to rise 2 to 3% to pay for the expenses, and probably an extra 4 to 5% more, since we, as the government, do not have the profit motive to make ourselves efficient. When you're facing a cost of living crisis, you face two options as a government. Stop printing money and destroy deficit spending like your life depends on it, or accelerate the money printer and hand out cash to everyone for free, which is what we were doing under Biden, of course. Subsidize everything. Don't tell people what's actually underway. Don't attack the root cause, the actual drivers of the cost increases, a big part of which, of course, is simply handing cash out for free. New York City, he continues, once the shining beacon of American exceptionalism is ironically on the brink of cannibalizing itself through socialism, history is moving in reverse. The next time a photo like this is taken, it'll be a New Yorker visiting another state's privately owned and operated supermarket. And I believe, if memory serves correctly, this is Gorbachev, who was the head of the Soviet Union in its last years, on a visit to America. He, as the most highest level Soviet official, was shocked at what American supermarkets could provide. Thanks for watching this highlight segment of our full-length Law of Self-Defense live stream. If you enjoyed this content, make sure to give us a like and subscribe for more expert analysis on politics, law, and how to be hard to convict. And to watch the full-length episode of this show, just click right here. Stay safe.